Coming up on this episode, what I believe the latest on Steve Kerr's future ultimately means for the franchise and the four-time championship winning coach. Plus, do the Warriors need to consider trading one of their stars this offseason? And no, I'm not talking about Draymond Green. Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast. We had a major update on Wednesday on the future of Steve Kerr as head coach of the Golden State Warriors. And while the report didn't necessarily tell us a whole lot, I think we can read between the lines and work out where this is heading. ESPN's Shams Charania, Anthony Slater, and Ramona Shelburne reported that Kerr and the Warriors, presumably Mike Dunleavy Jr. and Joe Lacob, primarily met on Monday for a 2-hour meeting. There was no resolution on Kerr's future, and he's now set to go on a golf trip for the rest of the week, and they will reconvene next week and discuss further his position at the Warriors and potentially thrash out a new contract for him to remain, not just for a last dance next season, but potentially for multiple more years. We know the Warriors don't necessarily want to go down the path of a last dance for just one more season. I think they'd like to get Steve on a multi-year deal. I've been saying all along, those of you that listened to me last week, I've said all along that I think the draft lottery, which is now next Sunday, May 10, is a hugely pivotal moment here in Steve Kerr's future at the franchise. And if we get this report today that Steve and the Warriors aren't going to meet again next week and that therefore a decision or a resolution won't be decided until then in my mind, why not wait until that May 10 draft lottery, just to see the outcome of that, just to get that extra piece of information? If you're going to wait till next week anyway, why not wait for that until after that, just to see what happens, where the Warriors, of course, will have a 9.4% chance of landing a top 4 pick. My assumption right now is that I think Steve Kerr is more likely to return to the Warriors than not, because I think that if he wasn't keen to return, he would have just told the Warriors by now. If he didn't want to coach this team anymore, he would just tell them. He would know. There was a report, I think, that came out just after the Warriors were eliminated against the Suns, saying that Steve Kerr's known for weeks that this was it. Well, if he's known, he has too much respect for the Warriors as an organization. He's not just going to be stringing them along. He would have told them if he didn't want the job already. He would have allowed them to go out and already be on the search for a new head coach, which the report from ESPN on Wednesday revealed that hasn't happened. The Warriors haven't gone out and looked at different coaching options yet. Of course, there's been plenty of speculation and suggestions on who they could possibly target, but the Warriors haven't actively gone out and sought anyone externally yet. So my assumption is that Steve Kerr wants to return to the Warriors, but there are other elements to this that I think are very important, and one of those is the draft lottery, because I think Steve's smart enough to know that, hey, if we get a top 4 pick, sure, that will give us plenty of more optionality and flexibility to go out and build the roster. Who knows, maybe with a top 4 pick, Mike Dunleavy Jr. can go and get me Giannis Antetokounmpo, and suddenly I can go into next season with Steph and Giannis. Who wouldn't want to coach that duo? Steve would be super keen for that, I have no doubt. But in his heart of hearts, he would also know that history would suggest Joe Lacob's pathway and the route he wants to take is to keep that pick, particularly in a draft that's kind of seen as a top 4 draft with potentially franchise cornerstone players among that top 4. Steve would know in his heart of hearts that Joe will probably want to keep that pick. He'll want to try and set up something meaningful in the post-Steph Curry era in a way that he obviously wasn't able to do with former top 10 picks in James Wiseman and Jonathan Kuminga. So in that scenario, Joe Lacob's pathway and the direction he wants to head is probably not going to be aligned with that of Steve Kerr. And therefore, I think in that situation, we could see a parting of ways between the franchise and their most successful ever coach. Outside of that, again, I'm finding it difficult to see a way in which Steve doesn't return here because, again, if he didn't want to do it, he would have told them already, in my opinion. The fact they're having a 2-hour conversation about it and then they're expected to reconvene next week, Like that, I think it's weird that the general practice of this when it comes to players, I think, is like the longer it goes, the less likely a player is to return and stuff like that. In this situation, it's like the longer it goes, the more likely Steve's going to return, in my opinion. So it's going to be super fascinating to see what happens at the draft lottery. Another thing that I wanted to mention came from Brian Windhorst in the last couple of days, who mentioned kind of just the contract element of this. And I think I've been under the assumption, a lot of Warrior fans have been under the assumption, perhaps wrongly, that, hey, if Steve wants to return, then he's going to get the opportunity to return. And it's just going to be as simple as that, right? If Steve wants to coach, Steve will be the coach. And it's as simple as that. When in reality, like, there's still a contract to be worked through here. And I thought Brian Windhorst, who was talking on the Yahoo Daily Show or something along those lines, Yahoo Sports, I thought he mentioned something really interesting about, hey, Steve Kerr was the highest paid coach in the league this season when he signed that 2-year, $35 million contract a couple of years ago. Highest paid coach in the league for a team that finished 10th, for a team that failed to make the playoffs. And that's not necessarily Steve's fault, right? Some people will put some blame on him. I put far more on the blame on just injury, like Jimmy Butler tearing his ACL. As Steve, in his own words, put that changed their season. Steph Curry being out for 27 games. I don't think there's too many other coaches out there that would have done a better job than Steve did over the final couple months of the season without Steph and without Jimmy. So I don't think it's necessarily a Steve Kerr issue. But the fact remains, like, do you want to be paying $17.5 million for a team that fails to make the playoffs? And Windhorst actually questioned, like, does Steve need to take a pay cut here? Do Joe and Mike go to Steve and say, hey, we think you're still an elite coach, but the fact is that there are real question marks and concerns on whether we can be a contender again, and we don't necessarily want to be paying absolute top dollar $17, $18 million. Can we get you back on something that is slightly smaller than that? Again, multi-year deal, I don't know, 2 years 30, 2 years 28, 3 years 40, I don't know, something along those lines. So I think we've just brushed away the actual financial contract side of things, as if Steve wants to coach, they'll work it out. And maybe I've been a little bit too easy in thinking, oh, well, they'll just roll him over onto a similar deal that he's been on the last couple of years. Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. Because if you're Joe Lacob, you're thinking, I don't want to be paying my head coach the top mark in the league if we're not actually a contender. Now, again, I would put the onus on Joe in that situation and say, all right, well, it's up to you and Mike Dunleavy Jr. to build a roster that's a contender. Steve Kerr's a 4-time championship winning coach. You give him the tools and he can go to work. If you don't give him the tools, then you're going to get what you got this season, which is a pretty average team. So I would put more of the responsibility on Joe Lacob and Mike Dunleavy Jr., but I could also understand why they're hesitant to necessarily just roll over Steve onto remaining as the highest paid coach in the league. A couple of other just options if Steve does depart. We heard Chris Mannix and Rachel Nichols discuss on the Sports Illustrated podcast that Billy Donovan could be waiting to see if the Warriors' head coaching role becomes an option. Obviously, he departed the Chicago Bulls as head coach over a week ago now. Seeing what he's going to do next, there's certainly going to be... Look, I don't love Billy Donovan as a coach, but he is a very experienced coach. He's been in the NBA system for 11 seasons. He's been a head coach at Florida for 20 years prior to that. So he's incredibly experienced. So I think I'd prefer Billy Donovan over like an untried person when it comes to the final years of Steph Curry's career. But I don't necessarily love Billy Donovan because if you look at his record, he obviously made the Western Conference Finals with the Thunder, going down to the Warriors after leading 3-1 in 2016. And since then, I think he's won one playoff series or something like that. He's made the playoffs like once in the last 6 seasons. And I think 3 times in the last 10 years or something. So the NBA coaching record isn't great when it comes to Billy Donovan. Another thing just to briefly mention here, Mike Brown, we had Sam Amick of The Athletic just report that, hey, if the Knicks don't make it all the way to the NBA Finals, which is an expectation that owner James Dolan has set upon this team, then there are going to be question marks over Mike Brown's future, despite having only signed a 4-year contract extension to join the Knicks this season. Being only 1 year through that, it would be incredibly brutal if the Knicks got to like the Eastern Conference Finals and James Dolan said, that's not good enough, Mike Brown, you're out. That'd be super unfair in my opinion, but it would also give the Warriors a potential opportunity to go out and target Mike Brown if Steve was to depart and if obviously Mike Brown became available because he was axed by the Knicks. So a couple of guys to watch there. Billy Donovan, Mike Brown, obviously he's experienced guys. Mike Brown, relationship with Steph Curry and Draymond Green if Steve Kerr does depart. But today, Wednesday's report from ESPN certainly suggested to me that Steve Kerr's return to the Warriors is far more likely than what it looked this time last week. The Warriors obviously have a lot of decisions to make this offseason with only 6 players currently contracted on their roster. One of those decisions might be whether to consider moving on from one of their stars in a blockbuster trade. Now, I'm not talking about Draymond Green, whose future is well and truly up in the air with a $27.6 million player option this offseason. Of course, if Draymond opts into that, then yes, there's a strong chance that Draymond Green in that contract is used in a trade this summer. However, if Draymond's to opt out of that to renegotiate a new deal with the Warriors at a lower salary, that would obviously take him out of being trade eligible until December 15 or whatever the date is. And therefore, if the Warriors wanted to land another star this offseason, matching salary would be incredibly difficult. Obviously, they have been linked already to the likes of Kawhi Leonard, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Kevin Durant. These are all players that are making upwards of $40 million this or next season, I should say. LeBron James, a little bit different. The Warriors could try and get him in for agency. But in terms of one of those 3 guys, KD, Giannis, and also Kawhi, it's going to be difficult. And in fact, it's very, very difficult to envisage the Warriors being able to pull off a move for one of those guys. Signing trades obviously get complicated and stuff like that. Unless the Warriors are willing to trade Jimmy Butler. That's what I've been kind of considering to myself in the past few days here is, would the Warriors think about trading Jimmy Butler this offseason? They were obviously adamant prior to the February midseason deadline that they weren't going to trade Jimmy, that if a Giannis trade was going to happen, everything we heard, as much as the Warriors were trying to be adamant that they wouldn't trade Draymond, everything we heard through the media was that there was going to be a package surrounding Draymond, JK, picks, whoever else, and it wasn't going to include Jimmy Butler, and that any Giannis trade would have Jimmy Butler still on the roster, have the Warriors having 3 guys making over $50 million per season. Again, unless Draymond opts into that contract, it makes it incredibly difficult to see how the Warriors would be able to acquire Giannis or KD or Kawhi or whoever it is making over essentially $40 million without including Jimmy. And it would be incredibly brutal to move on from him during his injury rehabilitation process. I think there is a moral aspect to this when it comes to not trading guys who just got injured. Now, obviously, if it's a role player, if it's someone that doesn't mean as much to your franchise, then we do see that. We saw the Warriors do it with DeAnthony Melton after he tore his ACL. At the very first point he could be traded, he was moved to the Brooklyn Nets along with a couple of second-round picks for Dennis Schroeder. Jimmy Butler is a completely different kettle of fish, though, obviously, when you're talking about what he means to the franchise, his impact as a player. But if we are talking simply about the priority of Steph Curry, the remaining years that he has left, the ambition to try and get a 5th championship for Steph Curry, then I would argue that everything should be on the table and that nothing aside from Steph should be off the table. And that includes Jimmy. Now, in an ideal world, I would love nothing more than for the Warriors to build a contending team that includes Jimmy Butler and that he can come back next season and try and get back to being his usual self, being his impactful best, but also being in a position where the Warriors, without him, are a reasonable team. And the worst thing next season is if Jimmy doesn't return until, let's say, halfway through the season, the Warriors are 10 games below 500, and they're basically already out of it when it comes to trying to produce a deep playoff run. That's my biggest fear. And so they have a really tough job this offseason to build a team that can, at the very least, keep their head above water without Jimmy until he comes back. But there's also a consideration to be made that maybe that's just not possible. Maybe building a contending team is just not possible while retaining Jimmy Butler. And then in order to get another upgrade, it's him and his contract that's going to have to be moved. Now, the Warriors, again, very adamant before the midseason deadline that they wouldn't trade Jimmy Butler after his ACL injury in January. However, I think there was also a case of, hey, we know that even if we were to dangle him as a trade candidate, no team is going to trade for a guy who's literally just torn his ACL, who's out for another 12 months, and who has another year left on his deal. It's a little bit different this offseason for two reasons. One, Jimmy's now on an expiring, which teams are going to be more willing to take on expiring. Like, I saw an interesting suggestion the other day. It's like, if the Warriors and 76ers got together, would the 76ers just flip Joel Embiid for Jimmy Butler? And I had a good laugh at it. I was like, it's actually interesting because Joel Embiid has 2 years left on his deal. Would the 76ers say, we're going to take a guy who's probably going to miss half of next season for us, but we want to get out of the Embiid contract? And would the Warriors say, look, you know what, we're just going to risk it on Embiid, right? Take the extra year of money and see what he could potentially do for us. I don't think the Warriors would go for it. In fact, it's one of those ones where I don't think either team would go for it. However, the fact that neither team would go for it is probably an indication that it might actually be fair value. It's a really interesting one. But if the Warriors do want an upgrade of some kind, and particularly one that is a better player than Jimmy while also obviously helping their ambitions from the start of next season, they don't have to necessarily worry about a guy missing half of next year, particularly now that Moses Moody's also going to miss half of next season. So, therefore, I think it's worth having the conversation. The fact that it's an expiring contract means it's now far more movable, I would have thought, than what it was mid-season in February. And because he's now further along the line in his rehabilitation process, it's like a team doesn't have to tell themselves, oh yeah, we have to wait 12 months to see this guy. Now it's like, oh, we only have to wait 6 months and we'll see him. He's further down the line now in terms of his recovery period. So even if the Warriors want to say we're adamant not trading Jimmy, I think it's worth the conversation. It's worth at least seeing what's out there. Because at the end of the day, if you can get your head in the Giannis sweepstakes, maybe it's Kawhi. Kawhi is a bit of a different one to me because I think Kawhi is a better player than Jimmy Butler, but he also has the similar kind of injury concern. So does Giannis too at this point, it must be said. So all these things have to be weighed up. KD, I think KD is a better player than Jimmy, but like from a locker room standpoint, like the vibes, the culture of the place, I think keeping Jimmy. And that also, again, that's another element to weigh up in this. But the Warriors can do as much as they want to be adamant that they're not trading Jimmy. That's not going to stop the trade rumors and speculation and suggestions this offseason. Just in recent days, we had the Embiid one I just mentioned. We had Bleacher Report coming out with the way in which the Warriors can land Giannis this offseason. That includes trading Jimmy Butler and Brandon Bajemski and picks and stuff like that. Eric Pincus, I think it was, at Bleacher Report. We had Bill Simmons with perhaps the wildest idea anyone will ever come up with this offseason. And it's not even the offseason. We're not even one round through the playoffs yet. And Bill Simmons is coming out on his podcast suggesting that the Warriors should go all in on the expendables. They should be trading Jimmy for KD and Clay in some kind of 3-team trade with the Rockets and the Mavericks. And that they should then be trying to sign LeBron in free agency. Could you imagine it? Could you imagine a team with Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, Draymond Green. And he also threw Al Horford coming back into that as well. Can you imagine that? The funniest thing about that is it's not impossible. Not impossible. If the Warriors could find a way to convince the Rockets or the Mavericks, and in this instance, more likely the Mavericks, to take on Jimmy, and one of them would probably have to take on Moses as well, just again for the salary matching purposes. KD doesn't actually make as much as what you think next season. It's like 43 million, which is actually like 11, 12 million less than Jimmy. But if you're going to bring in Clay at 17, 18 million, whatever he's on, you'd have to get an additional salary in there on top of Jimmy. So it could be like Jimmy and Moses and picks, obviously, for KD and Clay. Like it's incredibly, incredibly unlikely, but it's actually doable. And then you just get LeBron to take a massive pay cut and you get Draymond to take a massive pay cut. Like the funny thing is, like, he said it for a reason, Bill. And that's because, one, it's technically possible. And two, you do have plenty of uncertainty on the futures of Kevin Durant, who the Rockets, as I'm speaking right now, are down 3-1. Yes, they won game 4, but still in a massive hole against a Lakers team that's been without Luka Doncic and Austin Reeves. Clay's future, like, Clay should just want out of Dallas. Right? He should just want out of Dallas. That situation, I feel really bad for him and the situation he's found himself there at the Mavericks. If I was the Mavericks, I would probably be doing him a favor and just buying him out, because I'm not sure how much value Clay is necessarily going to have on the trade market with his contract. Not quite an $18 million player anymore. His numbers weren't that bad. He averaged nearly 11.7 points a game, 38.7% three-point shooting on obviously high volume. Clay ended up with the worst year of his career, but he's still a reasonable rotation player for you. And then LeBron's future is obviously uncertain as well. So there are a lot of star players whose futures are uncertain this offseason. We know, I'm very confident Giannis Antetokounmpo will be traded this offseason by the Milwaukee Bucks. But if the Warriors want to get in the conversation for one of these guys, you can throw Kawhi into the mix, whoever else. If the Warriors want to throw themselves in the conversation, then how are they actually doing it from a salary matching standpoint? They're just not, unless they're trading Jimmy Butler. So let me know what you think. Would you consider trading Jimmy Butler this offseason if it meant landing a Giannis, Kawhi, KD, someone of that ilk? Let me know. Or would you just keep Jimmy and hope that they can build a contending roster that allows him to come back to a team that is reasonable midway through the season, and then obviously push forward from them and push forward from there and try and be a contender? But I think it's worth a conversation for Mike Dunleavy Jr. in the front office, and obviously Mike has a strong relationship with Jimmy. I'm going to finish out there, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POC252. That's POK252 on X/Twitter. Golden State with Mates on Instagram and TikTok as well. I'll see you on the next episode.